Before this video starts, you're about to experience the fancy symbiosis of PowerShell and an user interface. I'm talking about every shell from Synchronet, a must-have for every SharePoint instance. Create, edit and delete SharePoint objects fast in having the benefit of PowerShell and navigate through a menu which provides you with all necessary options. Set objects which are hard to reach like property bag keys and values. No PowerShell knowledge required. You can buy it for only €19.99, approximately $28. Get it now at everyshell.synchronet.com and impress your boss, customer, or colleagues in working with SharePoint in a new, fast way. Welcome. I want to show you what the Secure Store is all about. When you go to Manage Service Applications and you don't have the SecureStoreService set up here, then you can create a new SecureStoreService, and as soon as you did that, you can click on it the first time. You will have to generate a new key. This key is going to be used for encryption, decryption of your credentials. I'm creating now this key. So here I created the key. That means now I can create a new target application. But before I do that, I want to explain a little bit what this is all about. As you see in the blog of Synchronet, you have here the code that you can implement to call the SecureStoreService to get the credentials to be able to impersonate. For example, if you have the situation that the users that are calling your custom code should be allowed to retrieve credentials for example, SQL access, then you would implement it like this. So you're using this SecureStore class. You have here your domain and your application ID. In this case, you could call it SQL Store. And then you would impersonate. That means this code goes into this. I will create here a new one. Let's say SQL Secure. Call it also the display name. I would create here a group. Then I click next. I keep it like this. I click next. That means here I would add here the user that will be then used to impersonate. And here I would need to add all the users which should be allowed to impersonate with this user. In this case, you could, let's say, if you want to allow all authenticated users the access, you could add here also all authenticated users. That means if someone calls, for example, this web part on the page, then it would check here if this user who is calling this web part is added here in the members. If it is, then you could retrieve the credentials of this user who is supposed to be able to access the target application. I created a little overview which should explain to you how this works. In this level, your source code is requesting credentials from the SecureStore. The SecureStore checks if this user who is which is requesting currently these credentials, if this user is allowed to retrieve them. If the user is, then the credentials will be returned. If it isn't, then you will run into an exception. Basically what it does, you have here the SecureStore object, and here you would impersonate, and everything that runs here below this area would run in this with this impersonated user. That means what this class does is, let's see where it starts. Here, this class, we have here the dispose methods and the application ID, and here you would have the impersonate method. That means this runs fairly straightforward. Basically, here is the part what happens when the credentials are retrieved. So you pass the application ID to this method, and here the code goes in, calls the SecureStoreService, and yeah, it will check if this application is existing, and if the current user has the sufficient rights to get them. If everything works correctly, then it would go in there and retrieve the necessary. Here you would have then the necessary credentials. That means the domain, the user, and the password, and everything works here. So here you would add a user which has then the rights for the secret database, and here in this area I would set for example this user. That means if this user comes to the page where this web part, which is calling the SecureStore, is integrated, if this user comes in, he would be allowed to retrieve here the credentials of the farm admin, then to be able to impersonate. If test2, for example, would access, it would run into an exception. So test2 is not allowed to get the credentials. What we do finally, this would be the application ID, what I forgot to mention. So the application ID, which is called here, is the one that we have set here. And now, last but not least, you would have to add here the credentials for the user. This is some kind of a security process, because when you debug your code afterwards, you will see that the code, when you debug this area, is showing you then the password in clear text. That means if you would be able just to enter here in the administrator, you would be able to abuse the SecureStoreService to retrieve passwords of, let's say, your colleagues. So you could add here a colleague, and you would debug your code, and over a sudden you would retrieve here his your colleague's password, and this is of course a measurement to avoid situations like that. So you always have to add here the credentials, and the credentials which are added here will be then used in this code. So this is basically it. This is how the SecureStore works. You have the code here which you can implement, which you can call then afterwards, and with which you can impersonate. So we would have here then our SQL calls, requests, and in this area, this application would impersonate then with our SQL secure user.